The Gaza Strip is home to 1.8 million Palestinians, 1.2 million of whom are refugees from surrounding areas to which Israel does not allow them to return. In the summer 2014, Israel attacked the population of Gaza with unprecedented force. The 11th most powerful military in the world used warships, drones, missiles, one-ton bombs, and Hellfire missiles to pummel the besieged Palestinian population, which had nowhere to hide. But this register of death and destruction was not merely the ugly outcome of war. Israel directly targeted Palestinian civilians as well. Israeli warplanes attacked 7 UNRWA schools providing shelter. In Jabalia, for example, the UN gave Israel its GPS coordinates 17 times to avoid hitting a school sheltering 3,000 people. Israel struck the school anyway and killed 17 Palestinians, including 4 children. Though unprecedented in degree, such military offensives have become a common feature of the coastal enclave. This was the 3rd attack in 6.5 years, the 14th time since Israel's settler withdrawal in 2005, and undoubtedly not the last onslaught against the Palestinians of Gaza.
Some media outlets casting Israel as the aggressor against Hamas, despite the barrage of Hamas terrorist rockets.
Another barrage of Hamas rockets fired from Gaza toward Tel Aviv.
Take a look at how Hamas terrorizes the country on a daily basis.
Because Hamas and Al-Qaeda are the same type of Islamist.
Support Israel. Support yourself.
During the devastating offensive, news media repeatedly framed the issue as Israel's fight against a marauding Muslim mob driven by religious hatred. Gaza seemed to float outside of history. But understanding these systematic offensives means understanding where Gaza fits in the larger question of Palestine. Israel claims that it's responding to Hamas rocket fire. But no one stopped to ask, if Hamas didn't launch its first rocket until 2001, nor its first suicide attack until 1994, then what explains an ongoing conflict for nearly 7 decades? If Hamas was not established until 1988, then why has Israel occupied the Gaza Strip since 1967? There are no rockets from the West Bank, from East Jerusalem, from Palestinian cities within Israel. So what explains Israel's abject disregard for those Palestinians? What explains settler takeovers, home demolitions, forced displacement, disproportionate use of force, arrest without due process, denial of entry, land confiscations, and movement restrictions? The explanation is found in Israel's relationship to all Palestinians. Israel's campaign against the Gaza Strip is not Gaza-specific. It's Palestine-specific. Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem. It has a Palestine problem. And it's guided by two primary policies. The first is to obtain the maximum amount of Palestinian land with the minimum number of Palestinian people. And the second is to concentrate the maximum number of Palestinians onto a minimum amount of land. Israel pursues a settler colonial project. It removes Palestinians and replaces them with Jewish Israelis. And it does so through dispossession, displacement, and concentration towards all Palestinians, regardless of where they live or what legal jurisdiction governs their lives. Israel achieves its goals using civil law in Israel, martial law in the West Bank, a mix of martial and administrative law in East Jerusalem, and all-out warfare in the Gaza Strip. In 1948, Zionist militias, together with European support, established Israel in Mandatory Palestine. This necessitated the systematic removal of the native Palestinian population and the demolition and destruction of their villages. Palestinians thus regard Israel's establishment as their Nakba, or catastrophe. For nearly 2 decades, Israel imposed martial law on its Palestinian citizens and dispossessed them in a series of land laws. Military orders, together with municipal master plans, have concentrated 46% of Palestinian Israelis in the northern district. In the Negev, simmering plans will uproot up to 70,000 Palestinians and concentrate them in urban townships. Since occupying the West Bank in 1967, and especially under the veneer of the peace process, Israel has removed, displaced, and concentrated Palestinians through settlement expansion, military roads, firing zones, bypass roads, parastatal settler takeovers, the annexation wall, and land confiscation. The Israeli Knesset is making plans to formally annex Area C, or 62% of the West Bank. The same policy is being pursued in the Gaza Strip. In addition to those displaced and killed in 2014, Israel expanded its buffer zone by 44%, intensifying the territory's severe density. Since Israel can no longer deploy boots on the ground in Gaza, though not for a lack of trying, it concentrates Palestinians from the perimeter and maintains their subjugation with repeated military campaigns, euphemistically known as mowing the lawn. Despite the different approaches, the outcome is the same. Israel controls the greatest amount of Palestinian land with the least number of Palestinians, and concentrates the greatest number of Palestinians on the least amount of fragmented lands. But why why would Israel pursue warfare in the Gaza Strip rather than use its West Bank policy for displacement and control? There, it outsources security to Palestinian forces and foots the bill to international donors. Because Israel wants the West Bank. Its religious claims there are more pronounced. It desires control of the Western Aquifer, one of the most significant sources of water in the region. And it wants to control the easternmost border, the Jordan Valley. In contrast, Israel doesn't want the Gaza Strip. By 2005, Israel only had 8,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip compared to 400,000 in the West Bank. It considers Gaza a cancer. The Strip has always been a hotbed of popular resistance, well before Hamas's establishment. Israel has repeatedly tried and failed to suppress the population using violence as well as co-optation strategies. Since the early 90s, Israel has set Gaza apart from the rest of the conflict and pursued a policy of isolation, de-development, and control. As early as 1993, Shimon Peres told a UNESCO conference that he saw the Gaza Strip progressively evolving into a Palestinian state while the West Bank becomes an autonomous polity of Palestinians and Israeli settlers whose status and borders would eventually be defined. In preparation for a peace deal ending the First Intifada, Israel imported foreign labor to replace its Palestinian labor force. Together with the impact of the First Gulf War, the economic downturn in the Gaza Strip was severe. In March 1993, Israel imposed a complete closure of Gaza, which was never fully lifted again. By this time, the Gazan economy was already dependent on Israel and incapable of self-sustenance. 9 months later, Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. By 1993, Israel had made Gaza dependent, announced an intention to transform it into the Palestinian state, and had sealed it off. All of this without a single rocket or a single suicide attack. Hamas launched its first suicide attack on April 7, 1994, in retaliation for the murder of 29 Palestinians praying in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. 2 years later, Benjamin Netanyahu assumed office and explicitly opposed the peace process.
לא פחדתי להתאבד עם קלינטון, לא פחדתי להתאבד עם אובמה. בלאו הכי את המחיר הבינלאומי אני משלם, אז עדיף לי כבר לקבל תמורה, ואת גודלם. עכשיו, הם לא רצו לתת את המכתב הזה, אז לא נתתי את הסכם חברון. הפסקתי את ישיבת הממשלה, אמרתי, אני לא חותם. רק כשהגיע המכתב, תוך כדי הישיבה, אליי ואל ערפאת, חתמתי על הסכם, והשררתי אותו, איך אתם קוראים. למה זה חשוב? כי באותו הרגע עצרתי את זה. בעצם אילו שעדיף לתת 2% מאשר לתת 100%. וזו הברירה שעומדת כאן הפרק. ואתה נתת 2%?
When the peace process crumbled 4 years after that, it set off the second Palestinian Intifada. In this context, Hamas launched its first mortar into Israel in March 2001. In April 2004, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon proposed complete withdrawal from Gaza in exchange for consolidation and control of the settlements in the West Bank. Unilateral disengagement in 2005 realized Israel's vision articulated by Shimon Peres in 1993. In the 18 months between Sharon's proposal and the execution, Israel launched 8 military campaigns that expanded the northern and southern buffer zones between the Gaza Strip and Israel and assassinated several Hamas political and military leaders. Those campaigns have never stopped. Together with the naval blockade and the land siege, the Gaza Strip has become a zone of death. Rocket fire and Hamas do not adequately explain what is happening in Gaza today. Israel militarily occupied the Gaza Strip in 1967 and has enclosed and impoverished it since 1991. Hamas did not emerge until 1988, did not launch its first suicide attack until 1994, and did not launch the first rocket attack until 2001. Even if Hamas were to disappear, Israel's policies towards the tiny coastal enclave would go uninterrupted, because what Israel demands is for Palestinians to accept Israeli domination as a way of life, an unfathomable possibility to all humans whose first instinct is to be free. The Palestinian leadership in the West Bank has gone to great lengths to meet Israel's demands. In response to their overtures, Israel has increased the settler population from 200,000 in 1993 to 600,000 today, and continues to remove and to concentrate Palestinians. Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem. It doesn't have a Gaza problem. It has a Palestine problem. The Gaza Strip represents the most vivid and grotesque form of Israel's settler colonial ambitions. Even before the start of Operation Protective Edge, the World Health Organization stated that the Gaza Strip would be unlivable by 2020. Much like Mars, where humans cannot survive due to a lack of oxygen, Palestinians will not be able to survive in Gaza due to the lack of hygiene, access to clean water, and food. But while Mars's harsh conditions are a product of nature, Gaza's conditions are the consequence of human collusion and complicity. Under these circumstances, a confrontation between Palestinians and Israel is inevitable. If we do nothing, Palestinians who continue to defy all odds will survive, as they have multiple onslaughts and decades of structural violence. But we should pay attention beyond the spectacle of war. Escaping this holding position demands a political solution, one that addresses the root of the conflict. And that root is Israel's desire to remove and erase Palestinians and to implant Jewish Israelis in their places. U.S. brokered peace talks have proposed and furthered ghettoized sovereignty as a solution. But Palestinians reject this and continue to demand freedom, equality, and dignity wherever they live, within Israel, within the Gaza Strip, within the West Bank, and beyond in the diaspora. What we see in Gaza is merely a symptom of this broader condition. It is untenable. It does not work. And unless we insist upon a viable alternative, we will see this horror repeated. Achieving a solution depends on each and every one of us. This is a human-made disaster, and it can and must be resolved with a human-made solution.